turn the lights back on. You can stop it, Chris. That's all we're going to watch. I thought that was a helpful video to kind of give us a visual representation and picture of this story. Obviously, we don't know exactly what everything looked like and happened, but as far as the words, that was a very faithful account of the actual words in the Bible that take place. And so I think it's pretty helpful for me, at least, to see that and think about this story. As we begin, we're in John chapter 9. You have several things here going on. If you remember last week, we talked about the dialogue, the conflict going on between Jesus and the Pharisees throughout John chapter 8. And that ended very heatedly in a conflict between him and them, and where they said that he was not yet 50 years old, and has he seen Abraham? And Jesus says, truly, truly, verse 58, I say to you, before Abraham was, I am. And so then they picked up stones to stone him. Well, Jesus is then going to leave from them, and it seems that it may be the case, as he's going out of the temple, chapter 9 then picks up, as he passed by, he saw a man blind from birth. Now, we're not sure, but it's possible that this is all in the same episode. That he goes from having this discussion, leaving them, and then he's leaving the temple area, and as he's passing by, there's a blind man that then prompts this conversation with his disciples, and then continues this argument, this dialogue with the Pharisees, who were obviously the guys in the video that you just saw that are going to be the antagonists throughout chapter 9 as well, who are trying to say he's not the Son of God, and who want to trap him and get him into disrepute with the people. They don't want the people following him. And so keep that in mind. I think it's interesting if that is the case. Now, it could have been that it was separate occasions. But I think it's interesting that Jesus was able to change gears that quickly. To go from in a hot debate with the Pharisees to them being able to show compassion to this man and heal him. It may have been, too, that this is kind of his answer to their debate. His answer to their debate is, you're all in darkness. You're all blind. If you go back to chapter 8, verse number 12, chapter 8, verse 12, where we started last week, Jesus would say, I am the light of the world. Whoever follows me will not walk in darkness, but will have the light of light. So, chapter 9 is an illustration of this same teaching that he's made back in chapter 8, verse 12, that he's been arguing with them about in chapter 8. He's saying, you're all in darkness. You're all in darkness. But Christ is proclaiming to be the light of the world. It's only through Christ that we can have light, that we can have salvation, that we can have truth illuminated in our hearts. And so I think it's interesting to see how these two chapters go together and how Jesus is teaching this concept of I'm the light of the world. And then if you go to the end of chapter 9, the end of the story, which when they put that video on YouTube, I don't know why they felt like they had to advertise the punchline of the story kind of got interrupted by them putting the ad for the next video. But Jesus says that final line in verse 41, if you were blind, you would have no guilt. But now that you say we see, your guilt remains. What does Christ mean by that? Remember, he's talking to them. He is talking about the fact that if they understood, if they grasped that they were in darkness, that they were blinded, then they could look to the light. They could remove their guilt. But what do they say? They're arrogant. They're boastful. They're proud. They say, we see. We're the children of Moses. We know it all. You are wrong. You're a blasphemer. We are the ones who have truth. And so their guilt remains. They stay in darkness. And the basic lesson John is trying to get across is that if you reject Jesus, you stay in darkness. If you reject Jesus, you stay in darkness. And it's not a complicated thing. It's not a complicated thing. Because here we have a man who is, in our story, chapter 9, we have a man who is not what we would say of the upper echelon of society. He was a man born blind, probably reserved to begging for his needs. A man who doesn't even fully know who heals him. And they put him on trial, and he says what is one of the most simplistic lines in the book of John. When they ask him about it, and he says in verse number 24, they say, give God the glory. And he says, verse 25, whether he is a sinner, I do not know. I don't know everything about who this guy is. But one thing I do know, that though I was blind, now I see. I know what he did for me. I know that this is a real miracle. That I was really blind, and now I really see. And he's going to, of course, come to faith in Jesus when Jesus will come back and tell him who he is and tell him that he's the Son of Man, he's the Son of God. But his faith is simple. And John is teaching us, if you will open your heart to God and not be blinded by your prejudices, blinded by your traditions, blinded by your arrogance, then you can see Jesus. Let's look at this in a little more detail, but I wanted to kind of give you an overview to start out with in thinking about this passage so that you kind of have an idea of it. And then we'll talk about any questions or comments that we might have as well. Let's begin in, first of all, let me ask, are there any comments or questions to this point, just kind of in that overview before we dive into it in more detail? Anybody got anything? Anything from the video or anything from what I've said?
Josh, do you think it was just coincidence or one of the more significant things of this event that it took place on the Sabbath? It seemed like that's what the Pharisees were more worried about. You would think somebody performed a great miracle, that would have been what they would have been interested in, instead of the fact that he broke their rules by doing it on the Sabbath.
Excuse me. Good question, Ronnie. It seems like most of Jesus' miracles that are emphasized that the Pharisees take issue with, at least, he always did on the Sabbath, doesn't it? Numerous ones he did on the Sabbath, probably to provoke some of this antagonism with the Pharisees and to point out their hypocrisy. That is why he did some of those things, because it's contrasting his mercy, and mercy being able to be shown on the Sabbath, to their legalism and their holding to the laws in such a rigid state that God wouldn't want that, because these are laws they designed. And so I think nothing Jesus does is totally on coincidence. So I think he intended for it to be on Sabbath and those kind of things. Some point to the making the mud, which is an odd part of the story. One of the reasons I showed you the video is because just to see that idea of spitting in his hand or spitting on the ground, however exactly that took place, and then making mud. But some say that that's one of the issues that the Pharisees would have had problems with, is that he was kneading or doing something there, making something. And also, so the Pharisees had such silly laws as to go that far. And so I think that I guess that's the best answer. I don't remember what else I was going to say. Ron, does that answer your question?
Yeah.
All right. Anybody else have anything? Any other comment or questions so far? Well, let's read the first few verses and talk about this first issue of who sinned. So as they're passing this man who was born blind, by the way, a couple things to keep in mind here. The emphasis on being born blind, it is thought that being born blind meant that he had, that's going to be connected in their theology with his being born into sin, born as a punishment for some sin of his parents or that he was going to do. And it's also thought that that would have made this blindness, because it was from the beginning, harder to heal. And I think just logically that makes sense, because if someone did see and then they go where they can't see, they used to see, and so someone could, there could be some trickery or there could be some kind of process of doing that. Glasses even today kind of take that, right? But this man had never seen. He had never seen. He was totally blind. And so the reason the text emphasizes that is to show the supernatural nature of this miracle. Another thing about this is that in the Old Testament, there's no record of anyone healing blindness. Blindness was thought to be extremely difficult thing to overcome. And no record of that. But the Messiah in the Old Testament, Isaiah chapter 9, I think it is, refers to the Messiah will give sight to the blind. So this is a work of the Messiah. And so Jesus is coming, and he's definitely claiming that he is the Messiah because he's giving sight to the blind, and he's healing someone who was born that way in this condition. And so the disciple says, "Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind?" This is often the doctrine of the Jewish people. That is, sin caused physical sickness and suffering. Even Jesus' disciples believed this. Now, here's the thing. The whole book of Job deals with this, but they still struggle with this. And Jesus is going to answer by talking about purpose. It was not that this man sinned or his parents, but that the works of God might be displayed in him. So Jesus doesn't go to cause, but he goes to purpose. Now, what about that question? The question they ask is this man in that physical suffering condition because of sin? And the broader question is all suffering because of sin? And I think this is an important question to answer, and I think it should best be said that yes, we suffer because of sin, but not all suffering is because of sin, right? It's not always an equal equation, that every time I see suffering, every time I see a consequence, that the cause is sin. In fact, we could think of many different reasons of why someone might be going through suffering, but it is not because of any sin they did or sin that, in this case, their parents did. And especially in this case, Jesus is debunking that myth that it was because he sinned or his parents sinned. But notice what Jesus does. He points to the purpose. The purpose is even despite this disformity, despite this suffering, God can still use it. And that God can still do something with this. And there's still a purpose in that. And so he will say that God still has a purpose here for this. And then he points out that we must work the works of him who sent me while it is day. For the night is coming when no one can work. We must do what we can. For as long as I am in the world, I am the light of the world. So he then points out once again how he is the light of the world, and he's breaking into the darkness of this world, which is figuratively illustrated by the blindness of this man. And so he's going to break in and give this man light. So there's a sense of where this man in blindness, though he was not born into sin, as we understand the Bible would teach against, he was not blind as a consequence of his parents' sin. We still understand that Jesus is going to give him physical healing, which in the story parallels the Pharisees and the world and how we all have darkness. We're all in blindness because of our sin. And Jesus gives us spiritual light, spiritual healing. So he will then spit on the ground. He'll make mud with the saliva. That's kind of odd. I read a commentary that talked a little bit about how pagans thought that there was power in saliva, and that was used sometimes in that kind of pagan rituals and worship. I don't know if that's why Jesus did that, to show his power in that area as well. I don't know if it had to do with the Pharisees, as I mentioned, violating their law there of kneading. For whatever reason, he does this. And he puts the mud on his eyes, and then he goes and washes in the pool of Siloam, and he comes back seeing. Any questions on the first 7 verses? All right, let's go on. Verse 8. The neighbors and those who had seen him before as a beggar were saying, "Is not this the man who used to sit and beg?" Some said, "It is he." Others said, "No, he's like him." And he kept saying, "I am the man." So they said to him, "Then how are your eyes open?" And he answered, "The man called Jesus made mud and anointed my eyes and said to me, 'Go to Siloam and wash.' So I went and washed and received my sight." In the early church, early non-biblical, this is not recorded in the Bible, but in the early church history, we see that this story is often going to be used with baptism. It's going to be used in the preaching and the teaching around baptism and in baptismal services. They would connect this story with baptism. And if you think about it, though that's probably not where our mind initially goes, if you think about it, it really makes pretty good sense, because you have this idea of someone being in darkness, someone told to go and wash. You know the biblical teaching on how it connects baptism and washing and how it uses that term, Acts 22:16 and Titus chapter 2, other places, Ephesians chapter 5, is washing. And so here he goes and washes, and he comes back seeing. He has the light, and so it really parallels nicely with baptism. And so the early church used this to teach on baptism and as a story even to connect and talk about that. So he goes and washes, and when he goes and washes, he comes back seeing. And the neighbors and others are questioning this, and he tells them about what he did. And they said to him, "Where is he?" And he said, "I do not know." So they brought, verse 13, they brought to the Pharisees the man who had formerly been blind. Now it was a Sabbath day when Jesus made the mud and opened his eyes. Notice once again, they talk about Jesus making the mud. So it seems like one of the problems they had was him making the mud. So the Pharisees again asked him how he had received his sight. He said to them, "He put mud on my eyes, and I washed, and I see." Some of the Pharisees said, "This man is not from God, for he does not keep the Sabbath." The point of that they keep coming back to is he can't be from God because he violated the Sabbath. But the others said, how can a man who's a sinner do such signs? That's the big problem. How can he really heal this man if he's not from God? So they began to argue amongst themselves. There was a division amongst them. And they said again to the blind man, if they could just get rid of the evidence, if they could just get rid of the blind man, but here you have a blind man who everybody knew was blind, and he's seeing, so he's really a problem in the court of public opinion, and in the court of the Pharisees here, he's a real problem because he obviously can see. So they ask him, what do you say about this man? And he says he is a prophet. Notice how the man's faith is progressing. He goes from calling him a man named Jesus to now he sees him as a prophet. As a prophet. The Jews did not believe that he had been blind and had received his sight until they called the parents of the man who had received his sight. And they asked him, is this your son, who you say was born blind? How then he now see? How then does he now see? His parents answered, we know that this is our son and that he was born blind. But how he now sees, we do not know, nor do we know who opened his eyes. They don't want anything to do with this. They're not going to take claim or culpability in this situation. So now he now sees, we do not know. Ask him, they said. He is of age. He will speak for himself. They put it off on him. Way to go, parents. His parents said to these things because they feared the Jews, for the Jews already had agreed that anyone should confess Jesus to be the Christ, he'd be put out of the synagogue. There were three major losses in being put out of the synagogue. You couldn't go to church, you couldn't go to synagogue to worship, you lost the privilege of worship, you lost the joy of fellowship, and you were treated as a heathen. So basically 2 of the 3 things that we had to suffer with during quarantine. We couldn't go to church, and we couldn't fellowship. But we didn't have the third one. But if you think about it, it is similar to the reasons why we should care about the church, and it's very similar to the teachings on church discipline and disfellowship. But it was a very serious thing to be treated as a heathen, to be cast out, to not be able to worship, to not be able to go to the synagogue, and to not be able to have fellowship with your brethren. And so they feared this. They feared this so much so that they would even not come to the defense of their son. There were 3 types of expulsion. 3 types of expulsion. You could be expelled for 1 week, 30 days, or you could be expelled permanently. We don't know from the text how long they were talking about expelling them, but we probably assume it was maybe the permanent one because they're very fearful of this, and they did not want to get in trouble. So this is how the Pharisees are trying to maintain their power of keeping the Jewish people faithful and not going over to Jesus' side by threatening them with the synagogue power. And so they asked him, verse 24, a second time. They called the man who had been blind and said to him, give glory to God, for we know that this man is a sinner. And he answered, remember, they're basing him being a sinner on him violating their laws, not God's laws, but their laws regarding the Sabbath. He answered, whether he is a sinner, I do not know. I'm not going to get into that, the man says, but one thing I do know, that though I was blind, now I see. They said to him, what did he do to you? How did he open your eyes? He said, I told you this already. You would not listen. Why do you want to hear it again? Do you also want to become his disciples? Are y'all trying to follow after him? Probably sarcastically there. And they reviled him, saying, you are his disciple, but we are disciples of Moses. We're not going to open our heart and our mind up to Jesus. We're following Moses. We know that God has spoken to Moses, but as for this man, we do not know where he comes from. Don't know how he gets this power, who he is. And the man answered, why then? This is an amazing thing. It's pretty shocking here. You do not know where he comes from, and yet he opened my eyes. Notice the simplicity of this. If you'll just look at the facts are, I was blind, now I see. I'm now healed. It's simple. He has to be from God, because because now I see. No one has ever done this before. As I mentioned, not done in the Old Testament. It's a sign of the Messiah. He is the Messiah. This is simple. We know that God does not listen to sinners, verse 31, but if anyone is a worshiper of God and does his will, God listens to him. Let me offer a caution here about verse 31. Sometimes people will use that to give evidence to the fact that God does not hear sinners. And the point of this verse is this is said by the Pharisees. And so this would not be a good verse to use for that, because you certainly don't want to take and say everything the Pharisees are saying here is truth. Now, I think that there could be a point made from other biblical passages that talk about God does not hear sinners in the sense of hard-hearted sinners, but I think you could also make a point that God is open to the humble-hearted and those who are seeking his will. And I would cite Cornelius in that Cornelius' prayers and his alms came before the throne of God, and Cornelius was not yet a Christian, but because he had a humble heart, a desiring heart, and was seeking the Lord, and his prayers came before the Lord, God sent Peter to him to preach to him the gospel. And so I think it is true that we can say that our prayers have to go through Jesus, and that a Christian has access to the throne of God. Others do not have Jesus as their high priest. They do not have access to the throne of God. And so in that sense, God does not hear sinners' prayers. But in other senses, I think that there could be a case made that you do not yet have to be a Christian for God to hear your prayers if you are wanting to become a Christian and wanting to have a humble heart and seek his will. I believe God then will providentially work it out, if that's your heart and that's your prayer, for you to come to know the truth. I think Cornelius and maybe some other examples could illustrate that. So don't use this verse. Don't use this verse to say God doesn't listen to sinners. You can make that case from other verses, but this verse is said by the Pharisees. Never since the world began, it has been heard that anyone opened the eyes of a man born blind. That's what I said about there's never a case in the Old Testament of anybody opening an eyes. And notice it's not just a blind person, but it's a man born blind. If the man were not from God, he could do nothing. I'm sorry, I said the Pharisees. It was this blind man who said this, not the Pharisees. But still, the blind man is not an inspired speaker and is not speaking truth here in that sense. He's just accounting his testimony. Verse 34. They answered him, "You were born to utter sin." This is the Pharisees again. "And would you teach us?" And then they cast him out. So they cast him out of the synagogue. Verse 35. When Jesus had heard that he had cast him out, notice this. Christ found him. And he said, "Do you believe in the Son of Man?" He answered, "Who is he, sir, that I may believe in him?" And Jesus said to him, "You have seen him. It is he who is speaking to you." And he said, "Lord, I believe." And he worshipped him. Jesus said, "For judgment I came into this world, that those who do not see may see." So that those who are spiritually blinded can have light, they can see. And he's bringing judgment so that those who see may become blind. Those who think they see, they are arrogant, can come blind, can become aware of their darkness, aware of their blindness. Some of the Pharisees near him heard these things and said to him, "Are we also blind?" And that's when Jesus said to them, "If you were blind, you would have no guilt. But now you say, 'We see.' They think they don't see, yet their guilt remains." We're about out of time, but I want to close by thinking about this one thought here. that I think is important. A couple things. Notice that Jesus allowed the man to have to suffer with all the trials, to be put out of the synagogue, to have to go through all these things, and then comes back to help him later. Sometimes in our life, I think Jesus gets us into stuff. He gets us into a lot of problems. Maybe even we get into a lot of problems, and Jesus wants us there to deal with it. And he leaves us there for a little while, and sometimes we're saying, Jesus, where are you? And he's saying, wait. And he comes back to help later on, after maybe we've been beaten up and discouraged. But he comes back to help us. And maybe he wanted to teach us something through that process. You think about how Jesus did this man. He healed him, and he left. He lets him go through all the problems, all the struggles, all the hard times, gets him kicked out of the synagogue, but he doesn't forget him. He comes back to him. I want you to remember that. And then I want you to ask one question to yourself. What blinds us? What agendas do we have that keep us from seeing the light? What traditions? What prejudices? What things do you and I have, or maybe someone in this audience has, that has kept them from coming to Christ? What do you have that's kept you from opening up your heart to the light of Christ? You see, the most dangerous thing is to be like these Pharisees, to say, we see, but have your guilt remain. To think you're saved, to think you're right, to think you're doing God's service, to think you're the children of Abraham, the children of Moses, as they were in chapter 8 and chapter 9, to think they're doing right by persecuting Jesus and trying to kill him. And yet they are so wrong. They can't even see the simplicity of, here's a man who healed a blind man. Surely he must be the Son of God. And so pray that we will not be blinded in our own lives. I appreciate your attention, and we're going to stop there. We'll pick up next week, Lord willing, with chapter 10. If you need to be dismissed, go ahead and be dismissed, and I'm going to stop at that point.